Today we're going to be doing logic. It is quite different from all the other classes that we've been doing, and there's going to be a certain caveat where how I'm going to begin. The caveat is, let's not draw parallels from English. This is a class where I'm going to ask you to not think about English or grammar or anything like that. Let's not even think about the rules of the language, okay? So when we're studying logic, we are looking at a universe in verbal which is slightly different from the world of English, okay? So keep it different. All right, so logic is very, very interesting. It is in fact one of my favorite subjects. How it is nice and how it, you can use it to your advantage is that it's almost like maths. There are clear-cut answers. If you know it, you know it. If you don't know it, you don't know it, right? So you'd have to pay attention. Now, if we were to, let's say, begin, okay, you can see the board. I've written deductive and inductive. What do these terms mean? These are the ways you can divide logic, right? So saying that logic or the questions in logic can be of two types. There can be deductive logic and there can be inductive logic. So today's class we're going to be concentrating on this part of it, just the deductive part of it. We're going to take up inductive in the next few classes. However, for us to even continue into logic and start basically build the background, we need to understand what is the ingredient of this class, right? Important word. Now for all of these questions, we'll use a fancy term called argument, right? So for all these questions, we're not going to say let's solve this question, we're going to say let's look at this argument, all right? Because logic has arguments, right? Now when you look at argument, this entire entity also has components, right? It is made up of three components broadly. I'm going to describe them over here, but let's look at who they are, right? There's a premise, then there is an assumption, and followed by something called a conclusion, right? Now these three things together make up an entire argument. All right, now what are they? What exactly is a premise? Assumption, well, we've heard of the word assumption. Conclusion is sort of self-explanatory, but how do these three things come together to make something called an argument, right? So these questions, in the beginning of the class I was telling you that do not try to get parallel, do not try to bring in parallels from English, do not try to think ye to ho hi nahi sakta, this is not possible because this is not grammatically correct. Leave English out of it, okay? These sentences are trying to convey something. You just have to look at the meaning of these sentences, right? What is a premise? A premise is a certain fact that is going to be true only for that argument, okay? And it can be absurd, it can be weird, it can be absolutely nonsensical, but for that question, the premise, if stated in entirety, howsoever awkward, weird or absurd or nonsensical it may seem, it has to be the truth that has to be considered for that question. Now, let me give you an example of this. If there is a certain premise which says India is in Pakistan and Pakistan is in China and China is on Mars, absolutely nonsensical if you think about it in real life, right? But for that question, you have to consider it as the only truth that you know for that question. Basically, what I'm trying to convey is that a premise is an indisputable fact for that question, for that argument. If something's given to you in the argument, it has to be taken at face value as the only thing that you know in the entire universe with respect to that question or argument, right? I hope I've made myself clear. So a premise is where your universe is limited to when an argument is concerned, right? Next comes an assumption. An assumption is that underlying thing which is true because the premise is true, okay? You know something because the premise says. Now these are things. An assumption is a thing which is implied or is implicit. What does implicit mean? Which is just like a fancy word for implied. Basically, you don't have to explicitly say it for it to be true. It is true by virtue of the premise being true. It is true because the premise is true. This assumption is a certain entity which is like a part and parcel of premise, not explicitly stated in the argument, but you can understand it by, because it is obviously true because this is there, right? And the next part is, of course, your conclusion, right? The last part of it. I hope you've understood the structure of an argument now. There's a premise, there's an assumption, and there's a conclusion. Perfect. Now, when we talk about, let's get back to what our original agenda was. Original agenda was that we're studying deductive logic today, right? So when we study deductive logic, when we look at the structure of an argument in deductive logic, it does have a premise. However, there is no assumption. So, the structure of an argument in deductive logic is limited to a premise and a conclusion. It will make more sense to you when we look at the way these questions are done. As we progress into the class, you're going to understand why is there no scope for an assumption in these. Right now, just remember that when we look at the structure of an argument in deductive logic, there's absolutely no scope for an assumption, right? All right. Now let's look at what these questions are going to look like, okay? So I'll just give you a flavor of it, okay? These questions, like I told you in the beginning, can often sound nonsensical. If you're a person who's never seen these questions before, when you look at these questions, this is exactly what my thought was. I tried to put English over there. I was like, what are they trying to prove? Men are bats and women are houses, and pens are plants and pencils are... So you'd come across various very weird looking, absurd looking sentences like these, but then you don't have to be scared. You don't have to just put English over there. Just don't put English. But how are you going to be able to solve these questions? You should know, you should be aware of how to represent these questions, okay? So now that I've told you how weird they're going to be looking, you're mentally prepared, right? That we're going in for some weird stuff. But if you know exactly how to represent these questions, how we're going to represent these questions, I'm going to get into that, you would be able to solve these questions. Remember how I told you in the beginning of the class that this is as direct as maths. There are absolutely bang-on direct answers to these questions if you know the approach how to solve it, right? There is, like for example, a 2 plus 2 is always 4. Therefore the parallels. You would always know that iska to yahi answer hoga. This is only going to have this answer. It's going to be that way. It's mathematical in its approach, right? Coming back to our class. Let's look at the first kind of sentence that you're going to be encountering if you were to solve these questions, okay?